As Bahrain continues its crackdown on the opposition, the U.S. State Department expresses concern over the Bahraini government's decision to disband two major political parties calling for reforms and a constitutional monarchy. Why did Bahrain opt for an iron fist approach against pro-democracy protesters? And what is the nature of the role of regional players in this Gulf country? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. 3 days after Egypt's former president was ousted from power, the people of Bahrain took to the streets to make their grievances heard. They were not demanding an end to the monarchy, but more representation. But a violent crackdown against protesters saw a shift in some of their demands. The monarchy was quick to portray the popular uprising as sectarian. Troops from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates entered Bahrain a month later as tensions began to grow. Now, in the latest move, Bahraini authorities pledged to seek court approval to dissolve two Shiite opposition groups for alleged links to the protests. This was met with a swift response from Washington, with the State Department urging the ruling Sunni minority to encourage pluralism instead. State Department spokesman Mark Toner said, "We're concerned by it. These were legitimate political societies that were recognized by the government of Bahrain." He went on to say, "We call on the government of Bahrain to support freedom of association and expression and to foster an environment that encourages political pluralism and participation." Well, following this criticism, Bahrain's government now appears to be pulling back from its initial plans to dismantle the two main Shia opposition groups. To discuss all this, we're joined by our guests in London, Saeed Al-Shihabi. He's from the Bahrain Freedom Movement. In Washington, D.C., Ali Al-Ahmad. He is the director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs. And we also have with us on the line from Manama, Mansour Al-Araid. He is the chairman of the Gulf Council for Foreign Relations. He's also a former senator. Welcome to you all. Ali Al-Ahmad in Washington. This change of heart on the part of the government, its decision to now somehow back down from its initial plans to dismantle these two main Shia opposition groups, even though it does seem like it wants to continue with its original plans. Do you think it is a result of some internal divisions within the ruling family itself, or is it simply a result of outside pressure from Washington?
I think, to be honest, this move in the beginning and the end, it's a diversion. And Washington is part of that diversion because there has been great criticism of the Hillary Clinton's position on Bahrain. They needed to have another issue to discuss, which is the political societies and their legitimacy and if they were dissolved or not. So to distract from the real issue, which is the demands of the protesters. So this is you can say, it's an agreement between Washington and Manama on creating a diversion because it was Washington that gave the green light for the invasion by Saudi and other Gulf troops. So Washington is not an impartial watcher to this or a monitor. It has participated in standing against the protest, albeit it was not in the open. It used or it allowed regional players like Saudi Arabia to do the bidding for Washington.
Just a smoke screen, Saeed Al-Shihabi, or something more, because now at least Washington is saying that it is concerned by this move. After all, it recognizes that these groups, including Al-Wifaq, the largest political party in Bahrain, with 18 of its representatives forming part of the 40-member parliament in Bahrain, it recognizes that it has operated legally all this time, that it is registered and legitimate.
Well, I think the question is beyond now the dissolution or the allowing of Al-Wifaq to operate. Because the situation has gone far beyond that. I mean, whether it dissolved Al-Wifaq or Al-Wifaq remains, what can Al-Wifaq do in the circumstances? I mean, all these societies have become marginalized. They have been humiliated. Their members have been arrested. Some of them have been killed. The latest victim was Karim Fakhrawi, who is a senior member in Al-Wifaq, and he was tortured to death in torture cells. So the situation now is not whether Al-Wifaq remains or goes, because Al-Wifaq now has realized that it is part of the mainstream popular movement that seeks to have a real reform in the country, and not whether to allow this society to operate or not. Nobody is asking for legitimacy from an illegitimate government for its existence and performance.
But Dr. Mansour Al-Araida in Manama, how important is it, though, for the government to allow these groups to operate? How can the government be serious about wanting to achieve a political solution to the crisis if it bans the main Shia party in the country?
The issue is now, it's not the issue of political parties, is how do we want to move forward? Now, the best way forward, the way I would see it, is the importance of having a real dialogue. But we have some issues. For example, Saeed al-Shahabi does not see that a dialogue is legitimate because he doesn't legitimize the ruling family altogether. And therefore, these calls hinder these attitudes and hinders our requirement that a dialogue is important.
But why is the government then refusing to engage in a dialogue with the more moderate, quote-unquote, moderate forces like Al-Wifaq, who have never called for the end of the rule of the Al-Khalifa family, who indeed only asked for a constitutional monarchy?
Originally, a dialogue was requested, and I would have hoped that the Wifaq could come to that table without putting preconditions. That was an opportunity. This did not happen. But there's another element into that. Now it has gone even beyond Bahrain. There is an important issue or some other elements that we need to look at. There's the GCC dimension. To call for a ruling family not to have a monarchy within a GCC context is irrational at this point. It is illogical and it doesn't work. It doesn't have popular support from all the people of Bahrain.
Then let's take this to Saeed al-Shahabi and get his thoughts. To what extent are the most widespread sentiments among protesters in Bahrain nationalist versus sectarian? Is this an indigenous push for democracy on the part of all segments of the society and, of course, the 70% of Shia Bahrainis, or is it simply a plot by regional powers, and let's be frank here, as Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf countries contend, by Iran?
Well, I think the world has seen in the streets of Bahrain what sort of demonstrations we had, whether there was any religious element in them or whether they were nationalistic and popular and progressive. We have asked that there should be a representative government, that there should be a political regime based on one man, one vote system. We have called for a society which is ruled by the rule of law and not by military dictatorship. We have called for a society which is whose wealth is distributed justly among the people, and not that one party takes 60% of the resources and the rest, the rest of the people share the rest. We have called for a society in which every citizen has the right to choose his own government. These are civil requirements. We have called for a society in which the human rights of the people are respected, not to be tortured to death beyond behind the closed doors of the torture cells.
Ali Al-Ahmad, what is wrong? What is wrong with these calls for more representation? What is wrong with these calls for more representation?
I don't think there is anything wrong with those representations, and this is not new. The people of Bahrain, especially the people of Bahrain, have been pushing for this. Let us remember that the first constitutional monarchy was established in Bahrain, and it was because the people of Bahrain wanted it in the 1970s. What happened is, when talking about dialogue, the people of Bahrain gave their ruling family a chance to and agreed and believed in them in 1970. But the ruling family turned in 1973, dissolved the legitimate parliament of Bahrain, suspended the constitution, which was drafted by popular vote. In 2002, the same thing happened. The people of Bahrain, 98% voted on the National Accord for a constitutional monarchy, but the current king turned it around and made it into an absolute monarchy. So the issue of dialogue is very tricky. I think it's a good idea to have a dialogue, but a dialogue that will result in another a trick by the ruling family against the people of Bahrain, I don't think that's the right way. There should be a dialogue on the lines that the people of Bahrain would be the deciders, the rulers. I think the monarchies, the absolute monarchies, not only in Bahrain, but in the Gulf, feel that they have the right and the so-called historical right of conqueror to continue this regime. This regime of absolute monarchy is unsustainable, and it will come to an end now or in 10 years. So it is really an opportunity for the Gulf monarchies to use Bahrain as an example, as a model, to turn into a constitutional monarchy. If they want to stay in power as constitutional monarchs, they should help Bahrain become one, so they can learn from that experience and then copy it in the rest of the Gulf countries.
Dr. Mansour Al-Araid, can the government, the monarchy, become more democratic and listen to the demands of the majority of the population, which is more representation? They tell them, stay in power, but give us more rights. We are simply marginalized politically and economically.
No, it can and it will. But there are some elements. For example, the statement of Shahabi today, 15th of April, he is calling that the monarchy are illegitimate. And he's calling, this kind of attitude hinders this kind of dialogue. In principle...
But this is one voice. Now we're talking about 70% of the population. Surely not everyone is echoing these thoughts. How do you explain the policies of the government over the last 10 years of granting expedient citizenship, for example, to foreigners, Sunni nationals from neighboring Arab countries, from Asian countries, and allowing them to serve in the special security forces, in essence, to quell what the government itself is very much depicting as a Shia rebellion? Does that help the atmosphere of dialogue?
First, you need to think that the Bahrain society is Shiites, Sunnis, and others. It is not only Shiites or only not Sunnis. We need to find some sort of a common platform to start the dialogue. Now, in principle, nobody disagrees with this dialogue, but the sooner that we can start it, the better it is for Bahrain. But that needs to be helped, needs to be encouraged. Statements that the ruling family is illegitimate, the issue of mixing human rights with democracy. For example, if you take the EU's recent motion, you see, human rights is one issue in itself. That is a legal issue that can be looked at and so on. But the process of democratization, the process of talking on how do you want to move the country forward, this is a different issue. Mixing this with that and then concluding an illegitimate ruling family is, I think, a very dangerous roadmap, because Bahrain is part of the GCC. It is unlike Egypt. It is unlike Iraq. It is unlike the other countries. This needs to be taken in context.
Saida Shihabi, looking at the GCC, the policies of the Bahraini government, asking for Saudi and UAE military intervention to help stabilize the country and make sure that security is established. Was that warranted, or was it a miscalculation on the part of the Saudi Arabians and other Gulf countries, in that it has also stirred sectarian emotions in their own countries? And over the last few days, we've seen demonstrations in Saudi Arabia itself, in the eastern provinces in Qatif, against this Saudi military intervention.
Well, no sovereign regime would call for outside help against its own people. Now we see Gaddafi doing the same, calling for mercenaries from other countries to suppress the people. Well, but that is something which is not acceptable by the international community. In Bahrain, there was no threat to the country. The country was not threatened by anybody. There were demonstrations, they were very civilized, they were very orderly. However, the ruling family called for the Saudis, or the Saudis probably pushed themselves on the Bahrainis and occupied their land. Bahrain today is under occupation, under direct, straight military occupation. And how can you have a dialogue under occupation? Secondly, how can you have dialogue when your people are in jail. The leaders, the leadership of the people, of the movement, of course of the movement, of the revolution behind bars, and being tortured and denied access by international human rights organizations. Only yesterday, the State Department has called for investigation into the death in custody of at least 4 people who lost their lives. We have more than 30 people have been killed illegitimately. And when we talk about the legitimacy of the ruling family, we are referring to the 1973 Constitution, which was the only source of popular legitimacy and constitutional legitimacy to the ruling family. They have abrogated, the ruling family abrogated that document, and this is why when we talk about illegitimacy, we are basing our argument on the fact that there was one document that was offering the ruling family its legitimacy, and it was abrogated by the ruling family, not by the people. So we are calling for a real change in the country, because we believe, and we have been proven right by the recent events, that a country, a regime that kills its own people, that arrests, that demolishes mosques, that demolishes all sorts of civil societies.
Well, let's put that to Dr. Mansour Al-Araida. How do you explain the fact that Shia mosques have been attacked by pro-government forces, including a prominent role by Saudi Arabian troops? Saudi Arabia, the custodian of the 2 holy places of Islam, engaging, according to reports, in the destruction of Shia places of worship, at least 2, perhaps even 5 of them.
Thank you. I think we need to look at it. I'll give you another perspective on this. First, the Saudis are part of the GCC agreed security regulation, where all the GCC countries have actually agreed together in a document that they would send troops to any country that actually needs it for either inside threat or outside threat. That's open also for debate. So there is a legal basis for that.
But the mandate of the GCC in this regard is very specific. It is to deal with the external threats and not with internal upheavals. And after all, these were civilian protesters that we're talking about. There were no gunships. There were no gun battles. Iran wasn't engaged in any external aggression. Would you agree?
Thank you. Yes. Now, what I'm saying, in principle, there's a legal basis for that. Secondly, now, how was that used, whether it was used correctly or in the wrong way, it is under investigation. There has been calls from the EU, from the US, and also from other NGOs and non-governments to have an independent look into this, and the king has had a decree to do that, and they're looking into these events. Now we await that investigation so we can actually see what's going on and then move forward. That's the first step. Now, in terms of the mosque and so on, there's a lot of small, what do you call it? They are not mosques. There are places of small, I'll give you the word in Arabic.
Well, they're being described as mosques in any reports that we read about.
Now, if any atrocities have been done on mosques, then that is illegal and the law will take its course. That is simply my answer to this.
All right. Well, let's now remind ourselves a little bit of what has happened in Bahrain so far. As we mentioned earlier, it was only 3 days after the fall of President Mubarak's regime that thousands of protesters gathered in Manama calling for democratic reforms and a constitutional monarchy. A security crackdown results in the death of several protesters as the ruling Khalifa family declares Bahrain to be on the brink of a sectarian abyss. The king then releases a number of political prisoners as a conciliatory gesture. A month into the uprising, Saudi troops enter Bahrain. Authorities declare martial law and clamp down hard on pro-democracy activists. Protests continue to this day despite a ban on demonstration. Ali Al-Ahmad in Washington. Earlier, Saeed Ashihabi was talking about the need for some kind of pressure to be applied on Bahrain in order to make sure that change will come about. Can change come about in that country if the US doesn't play a more important role, if President Obama, for instance, doesn't express more than just concern at what's going on?
The United States has so far showed, and because I'm in Washington, I can attest to that the United States government has so far refused to be on the side of the people of Bahrain. That is a clear cut for me here in Washington. The European Union, I think, is taking another venue, another look at this, and it could be the Europeans who were players in Bahrain until the 1970s could be the factor that changes the situation in favor of the people of Bahrain. Talking about the occupation, it was the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact that invaded Czechoslovakia, and it was called an occupation, despite the fact that it was asked or requested by the government of Czechoslovakia in 1954. The same thing in Afghanistan in 1979. The government of Afghanistan requested the Russian troops to come in, and this was called an occupation. So the issue here, it has to do with international pressure. I think Europeans will be the one who will change their policy and push the Bahraini monarchy into accepting the demands of the people into a constitutional monarchy, because Bahrain really is a small country that could be an example, a model for the United States and Europe to prove that they are sincere. Right now, the United States has lost a lot of its legitimacy and credibility in the region in regards to supporting the people's demand. You don't see Hillary Clinton talking about change in Bahrain, talks about reform, talks about change in Libya. It does not talk about the aspiration of the people of Bahrain, it talks about the aspiration of the people of Libya. So that shows you that because Bahrain has proven to be a place where the West and the East are meeting, it will be a test for the Europeans, the Americans, and even for the Iranians to see if they are willing to support the people of Bahrain. And the reason that they are not doing that right now because the Saudi pressure, but that Saudi pressure is going to go away.
Well, Saudi pressure, Saeeda Shihabi, we haven't heard a word from Washington criticizing the Saudi military intervention in Bahrain. Do you think the situation would have been very different if, let's say, Iran had sent in troops to help Syria quell the protests there?
Well, of course, the situation would have been fundamentally different. I think this double standard policy is short-sighted. It cannot guarantee or safeguard the U.S. interests in the region. I think the U.S. interests are best served with people participation in local government and people generally satisfied with the way they are ruled. And in other countries, in the GCC, other countries which are ruling their people in a more dignified way, you don't see all these popular movements. You only see this popular movement in a place where the people are downtrodden, are marginalized, and are denied basic rights.
Dr. Mansour Al-Araid, why aren't we seeing the same level of humanitarian concern in Washington and other Western capitals for the civilians in Bahrain, as we have seen for those in Libya, for example?
Bahrain is not a revolution, it's a process. Now, that process can only go through a dialogue. Bahrain is a monarchy, and it's part of the GCC fabric. Now, this is an important element to keep in place.
That doesn't lessen the demands of the protesters. It is still an uprising, and there's still a sizable segment of the population who believe they are marginalized and they need to get their rights from the monarchy, even if it is to stay in power.
That's fine. They have all the right to do so. When we're talking about economic and social, that's fine. But when it comes to political reform, you need to bring all the parties to the table. You cannot isolate other parties. There are Sunni parties. There is an element of the GCC element. And there's an important element also, as I said. There is a religious element. This value of religious element is the East values. Basically, the Sunnis and the Shi'is in Bahrain needs to coexist because we are proxies of two large neighboring countries, which is Saudi Arabia, a pillar of Islam, and of course Iraq and Iran is another pillar.
Is this still the case? There was a fear that Iran would export its revolution. That hasn't happened. Isn't this an indigenous push for democracy?
What I'm saying, I needed to bring it back to monarch versus people. That needs the help of the US, the EU, in order that it becomes only an issue between the people and the monarchy. That is the objective of the dialogue.
And on this note, we have to end our program. Mansour Al Arayid, Saida Shihabi and Ali Al Ahmed, thank you all very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for staying with us. As always, do send us your comments or suggestions. You can email them at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching.